Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Maddie and today we are going to talk about the books that I read in June. So first of all, I wanted to give a dad joke as always. What do you call a belt with a watch on it? A waste of time. I actually have a book that will go with that joke in a little bit, so keep your eyes peeled. But alright, so I had an amazing reading month in June. Because of whatever-athon, because of what Maddie over at Books Browsing Blog was able to, I honestly think, motivate so many people to read so many books in just 1 month. It was just amazing to see how many people were able to read this much, and also just to see how much it pushed me to read. This is by far the best reading month I've ever had in my life. I read so many books, and I'm going to go over all of them with you guys in this video, and honestly, all of them were really good books too. Like, most of them were 4 or 5-star books, so I'm really happy with what I read, and I'm really excited to talk about them with you guys. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to do is go over some stats. So for the month of June, I had a bunch of 4 and 5-star rated books. So as you can see over at the table, I had 1 DNF, which I will talk about a little later, 0, 1, 2, and 3-star books. So again, amazing reading month. I had 9 4-star books and 3 5-star books. As far as genres go, I read 4 science fiction books, 2 fantasy books, 5 contemporary, which I wasn't expecting. That's probably the most contemporary I've ever read in 1 month, and 2 horror books. And I'm really happy that I read some horror because it's been a while since I've read them. And then as far as the main stats go for the month, I read 13 books total. The average page length from all of the books was about 326, which is a pretty decent size. I read a total of 4,238 pages this month, which is by far the most I've ever read. And I also read 53 out of the 50 books for the year. So as you could tell, my record has been shattered. The goal that I wanted to reach by the end of the year has already been reached by the middle of the year. So I'm unofficially extending that goal to be 100 books. So I'm going to hopefully try to finish 100 books this year, but we'll see. I'm just really happy that I beat 50 books, to be honest. I'm going to see where it goes from there. And now let's get to the next part, which is the leveling up of my character for the TBR side-scroller game. So I started off at level 1, like all of you will be starting for this month, and I went ahead and actually logged my books and the points that I earned last month because I really wanted to make sure that it actually worked, and because I wanted to get a little bit of a head start for you guys so you could see how the leveling up actually works and also how the point system works. So like I said, I read 13 books, and you're going to see on the table that I'm going to be having on the screen here all the 13 books with the names of the books, and I'm going to actually go over them as well throughout this video. But the 13 books names are listed on the table. I also gave the prompt for it because I didn't actually have the prompt system and I didn't actually play the TBR game that month. I just used whatever-athon for the majority of the prompts, and then I also read an ARC this month, so I had those as the reasons for why I read those books. And then as far as the experience, the first column is the number of pages that those books were, which, as I've described in the previous video for the rules, 1 page equals 1 experience point. So that's the list of experience points that I earned from just reading the books and finishing them. And then the next column is any extra points that I earned. So those extra points were because I've either bought those books within this last year, or they were part of a book club. They were over 400 pages, as you could see some of them were. So yeah, there's quite a few points that I earned from just extra points through those. And then the last column is, of course, the total amount of points that I earned for each book. And then the next table that I have shown here is the totals table for all of the points that I earned and to show what level my character is now. So I had 0 experience points going in because it was the start of the game. This is what your table is going to look like at the end of July, or at the end of the month that you are in now. So it started off at 0. I have 100 points. Actually, the table is a little wrong. I actually have 100 points for side quests because I was able to review every single book that I read this month, which if you go back to the rules, you will see that that is one of the side quests, which earns me an extra 100 experience. And then I did not have a campaign for this month because, again, it was a trial run. I will hopefully be having a campaign video coming up this month for you to earn some extra experience. So I didn't earn any experience from campaigns. So it gave me a total of 5,131 experience. And because I had 0 experience starting, it immediately bumped me up to level 4. And I'm actually really close to level 5, as you could see by my HP bar. Okay, so stats aside, now let's go ahead and talk about all of the books that I read, what I rated them, and what my overall thoughts were. So to start off, I'm going to actually talk about my DNF book to get that out of the way. The book that I DNF'd, or if you don't know what that means, it means did not finish, was Call Me By Your Name by Aciman. If you actually go back to my previous vlog, you'll hear my thoughts as I was reading it, but I did not enjoy reading this book. It was not really fun. The main narrator was very descriptive of his feelings towards the other main character, and it was kind of awkward, and I felt uncomfortable. And I normally don't feel comfortable about books, especially with stuff that usually trigger other people, but I did not appreciate how this narrator was talking, and it just was very boring. It was uninteresting. I read a little over halfway through, and I tried to finish it, even if it would end up turning into 1 star, but I just couldn't finish it. So I didn't want to put myself through any more of the misery, so I DNF'd it. Now going on to the actual list, or the order of books that I read throughout the month of June. The first book that I read was The Ones We're Meant to Find by Joan. I mentioned this book in my previous video, the mid-year book Freakout, because of the fact that this cover was so beautiful. I mean, again, just look at how beautiful this cover is. It's just so nice. This book, if you didn't know, is about 2 sisters who were separated, and one of them, C, lives on this deserted island. She's trying to get off of the island to be able to get back to her sister. The other sister, Casey, she lives on a sky city, which are spread out throughout the Earth because the environment is depleting, and it's getting so bad that there are so many natural disasters happening to the point where humanity is really hard for them to live on the actual Earth. So he built these sky cities to be able to live on, but you have to have a certain environmental standard to be able to live on them, which means that you have to be conscientious of your environmental, green thumb to be able to live on these cities. And so the whole story is about how they're trying to find each other and trying to figure out what had ended up happening to them and why they were separated. It was a very good story. I ended up giving it 4 stars. And I really recommend this story. Okay, so the next book that I read was Saga Volume 5. It's a continuation of the Saga series that I've been reading every month. I've already described it in previous wrap-ups and previous videos, but in case you didn't know, Saga is a story about these 2 different alien species falling in, 2 different people from a different alien species. They fall in love with each other even though their species are at war with each other, and they end up having a child. And then the whole story is about them trying to get away from those other species and the different races that are tied with those other races. It's very interesting. It's very gory, very romantic. There's a lot of really intense scenes in this story, and this one in particular was really interesting. It actually had kind of finalized one of the loose ends that had been throughout the last 2 volumes, but then of course it created so many more loose ends. It really kept me on the edge of my seat. I'm really excited to read Volume 6, although it's probably not going to be for another month or 2 because I have quite a bit going on this next month. But I give it 4 stars. I pretty much give all graphic novels 4 stars, so it doesn't surprise me that this one was also 4 stars, although it was close to 5. But if you haven't heard about this series and you're interested in it, I highly recommend it. There are 9 volumes out so far, so I'm trying to take my time with reading them because it's been a while since the new volume had come out. And yeah, I'm hoping to continue reading this soon. So the next book that I read was Honey Girl by Morgan Rogers. This one was actually really interesting to read. I wasn't sure about this. The author's, it's her debut novel, so I obviously hadn't read anything from this author before, and it was a book that I had heard quite a few people, quite a few booktubers talk about. Actually, I think the first time that I had heard this book mentioned was from Noelle Gallagher over at Noelle Gallagher. I'll leave her link in her channel in the description. I was really interested in it. I had heard some mixed reviews about it, so I was curious to read it, and obviously got it from Book of the Month. So I was excited to finally get started on it. But in case you don't know, so it's about this girl, Grace Porter, and she just got her PhD in astronomy and physics. She was really happy about it, so she went to celebrate by going to Las Vegas and with a bunch of friends of hers. But what she didn't realize was that she was going to get drunk married at Las Vegas to another girl, one that she does not know. And so this story is about her trying to find this girl who lives in New York City, so on the complete opposite coast of where Grace lives. And it's a romance in that, she kind of falls in love with this girl that she wasn't really expecting to fall in love with, didn't even know. But then there's also a whole other story to it in that she basically trying to find herself. She is a woman that has very high, intelligence, that she has a high degree, and that she's trying to find a place in the workforce, in the world, to be able to really use her skills and to give back to humanity in a way that she feels is appropriate. And it's pretty hard to read in some spots, because it definitely, you could see the strain that she goes through in order to find that place. But it was pretty interesting. I wish that the ending had a little bit more to it, but overall I thought it was a really good story. I ended up giving it 4 stars, and I just want everyone to know that it's a romance, but it's not a romance for the entire book. So if you go into it thinking it's a romance, you're going to be disappointed. So I just want to make sure you know that this is not necessarily a romance, but it is a very interesting read nonetheless. The next book that I read was Heartstopper Volume 1. I ended up trying to fit this in. It wasn't part of my original TBR, but I tried to fit it in because it was Pride Month, it was for whatever-athon, and I really wanted to read this first volume. I've been wanting to read Heartstopper for quite a long time. This is a graphic novel from the UK, and it follows 2 boys that you could tell that they really like each other, but the one isn't outwardly gay, or at least he hasn't publicly announced that he is. So Charlie Spring, who is a boy that has been outed as gay in high school, he finds this other boy, Nick Nelson, and he finds him attractive. He actually is interested in him. And so they end up becoming friends, and they become closer friends, and then you start to see their relationship develop. But obviously Nick is embarrassed about it, because he didn't know that he was gay in the first place. And so it's a really cute and I've heard pretty serious story in the future. I've obviously only read 1 volume. There are 3 volumes currently out, with the 4th one coming out at the end of the year. It's definitely a really good story. I'm excited to continue reading it, and it was a very quick read, so I recommend it. The next book that was on my TBR that I read in the month of June was A Darker Shade of Magic by V. Schwab. It is the first book in a trilogy about magic, and it was by far one of my favorite books that I have read this month, and it was by far one of the best books I've read this year. So it follows Kel, who is from Red London, and he is this, he's able to go between the different worlds. So there's these doorways that connect different worlds, and he calls them Red London, Grey London, Black London, and White London. So each of these Londons kind of have a different form of magic, or a different kind of feel to the society. Red London is overwhelmed with magic, and it's definitely one of the nicer of the Londons. It's where he grew up. Then there is Grey London, which is very much like our London, our world, in that magic is not impossible to find, although it's very rare and most people don't know what it is. And that's where our second character, Delilah, is from. And she ends up running into Kel at some point, because they were trying to find this black stone, basically, that comes from Black London. Now, Black London is a London where magic kind of grew in itself, in that it overwhelmed humanity and became just uncontrollable. They couldn't control it, and it became to the point where it was snuffing out humanity. And so the doorways to all of the Londons were barricaded, because they didn't want Black London's influence to seep into the other worlds. Kel found a stone that came from Black London, and he wants to try and bring it back to Black London. And unfortunately, Delilah kind of finds the stone when Kel couldn't find it, and she ends up becoming enwrapped in this story. And it's really interesting to see how their dynamic develops throughout the story. And there was one other London. It was White London. White London is also kind of like Red London, except magic is starting to go away. It's starting to disappear. And so people are holding on to as much as possible by tattooing runes into their skin and finding artifacts that has a little bit of magic that's left in the world. And it's definitely a lot more bloodthirsty and a lot more intense of a world. And so it's a really interesting story about different monarchs of the different Londons, and how they all influence each other, but the only person that can actually go between them and really change anything is Kel himself. And this first book was really interesting to read. It had a really good ending that felt standalone in its own, but there are 2 other books to the series, and I'm going to be reading the second book in the month of July. And the Darker Shade of Magic, I ended up giving that 5 stars, in case that wasn't obvious. Okay, so another 5-star book that I read during my New York City trip, and I didn't necessarily intend to want to get super into this story. It was one that I was interested in, that I obviously wanted to read. It was part of my TBR, but I didn't know if I would actually love it or not. It was definitely one that I didn't really know much about, and so I decided that I would bring that book to my vacation, because I was like, okay, I'm going to be able to read a little bit. It's going to be on my vacation, so I'm not going to be able to read too much. I didn't want to start anything that I really wanted to read, so I ended up starting this book. It was Conventionally Yours by Annabeth Albert, and if you watched my last video, you would know that I ended up falling in love with the story. It is 5 stars, hands down. The sequel to this story is coming out in just a couple days, and I am so excited about it. It's called Out of Character. So this story follows Conrad and Alden. So they both play this game that's kind of like Magic the Gathering. It's a card game that is very popular in the world, and they basically want to travel to California where there's this big tournament that's taking place. And they have to go across the country in a van in order to get to it because because of circumstances that makes it so that they can't just fly down there. And both Alden and Conrad have their own reasons for why they really want to win this competition. And they're kind of rivals with each other, but as the story progresses and as they go cross country, you kind of see that maybe they're not as much rivals as you were expecting. Maybe they don't hate each other as much as they thought they did. And so the story is really cute. It's very nerdy. It definitely has a lot of really cute scenes and really intense scenes in that you just want to know what's going to happen. You want them to be happy with each other and just in general. And it's very deep, very amazing, and I highly, highly recommend this book, and I cannot wait for the second book to come out. So I apparently did all my 5 stars back to back to back, and it did end up kind of turning out this way when I was reading them anyway. So the next book that I read, and one that I was so hyped for, it was definitely one of my most anticipated reads for 2021, and it is One Last Stop by Casey McQuiston. I read Red, White, and Royal Blue a couple months ago, and I fell in love with it, just like everyone else on TikTok and on YouTube. And I was so excited when I found out about One Last Stop. Maddie over at Books Browsing blog had read an arc of this story and told us about how amazing it was and how different it was. And so when I picked this up, I already was excited about it, and it blew my mind. It's a story about August, who has lived in New York City for not too long, and she's kind of just finding her way. She's trying to figure out where her purpose is, where her life should go. And she's gone to school for several different types of studies, basically trying to figure out, like, okay, is she more than what her life has been, which has basically been a detective. There's a lot going on with her family, and that she's kind of tried to get away from them. And she finds herself in New York City in the process, where she's actually starting to feel like she's comfortable in this city. But then when she goes on the subway one day, she meets this girl, Jane, and her life turns upside down. She ends up falling in love with this girl that she doesn't even know. And as you start to see their relationship develop and start to kind of see how close they end up getting, you realize that it's strange that Jane's always on the subway, and she always seems to be on the subway when August goes on. And you quickly realize that Jane is stuck on the subway. But even worse, she's not just stuck on the subway, she's from a whole nother decade. And so it has a sci-fi twist in that Jane is stuck on the subway when she was supposed to be living in the 1970s. And so it is such an interesting story. I loved it so much. It had an amazing ending. I gave it 5 stars, and if you haven't read this or Red, White, and Royal Blue, I recommend you picking it up immediately if you like cute love stories, but also like a little bit of a sci-fi twist to it. The next book that I read in the month of June was Docile by K.M. Szpara. This book was for the Burned Book Club over with Books Browsing blog, Maddie, and also Spoops from Spoopy Hole. It was a very interesting story. I was a little concerned about it when I first heard about what it's about, and there's quite a few triggers with this. If you're triggered by rape, sexual abuse, slavery, there's quite a bit of triggers. I would recommend looking into the triggers before you start reading this book. It's about this guy, Elijah, and how basically this is a dystopian world where your debts are passed down to you by your family, and so like they start to accumulate quite a bit. And it's to the point where you either go to debtor's prison because, you know, you just have too much debt, or you try to pay them off by becoming a docile. Dociles are basically slaves in that they work for someone that pays off some or most of their debts, and that's how you can pay them off for a certain amount of time. Could be 5 years, it could be your entire life. And you are given the option of taking this drug called Docile, and it basically makes you docile. It makes you not be able to like really know what's going on around you. You don't really feel emotions. You don't really realize what's happening around you. And it obviously makes it a bit more comfortable of an experience when you are a docile. But the story is about how Elijah ends up he ends up becoming a docile, but the twist is that he does not take Docile. So it's about how he goes through basically what a docile goes through, but he's very aware of what's happening, and you see him changing even though he doesn't take the Docile. You end up kind of seeing that, like, it kind of seems like he's turning into what people are when they're on Docile. And it's a very interesting story. It's very, very good. I ended up giving it 4 stars because the ending just kind of dragged a little bit for me. But overall, it was an amazing story, and I highly recommend reading it. But again, if you are triggered or if you're worried about anything as far as the things I told you about, then I would be wary about reading this. But it is very, very good if you can handle that. The next book that I read was Truthwitch by Susan Dennard. This is a story. It's the first book in I believe the series is called the Witchlands series. It is pretty interesting. I read it because I had a lot of people recommend it to me. I ended up giving it 4 stars. It was good. I think there was a lot of confusing moments in the story, but it's basically about Sophia, who is a truth witch. And truth witches are those people that can tell if someone is lying or not when they're speaking, when they're telling you something. And then there's also Isolde, who is a thread witch. And thread witches are people that can see threads of emotions from people. So she could tell if someone's like upset or worried or happy or delighted or, you know, whatever kind of emotion you could think of. And there's several other types of witches. There's like the normal witches, which are like the wind witches or the tide witches, I think they're called. Like there's several different other witches that do other things. And a thread witch is like sort of rare, but not really. But truth witches are very, very rare, and they're very sought after, but in kind of bad ways. Like people kind of abuse their powers. And both of these characters are not marked, so like no one knows who they are, which is very illegal. And so they're kind of like on the run from that. There seems to be a lot of other things happening, like with the governments and with like this 20-year treaty that happened where like all the different countries were kind of at peace with each other because of this 20-year treaty, but now the treaty has ended or is ending. So like there seems to be a lot of subterfuge going on between the different countries, and these two characters kind of get in the middle of it as they're trying to escape from a blood witch who is a very rare void witch that can like sense people through their blood once they can smell you, and they seem to be able to like control you through blood as well. And so they're very dangerous people, and this blood witch in particular seems to be trying to seek after Sophia because of these political things that are happening. And it's a pretty interesting story. I don't know how much I loved it. Like I gave it 4 stars, so I obviously was interested in it, but I don't know how much I actually enjoyed the story, and that it was a little complicated, and it was also a little boring, some of the characters. So I want to read the second book and see exactly if it's something that I would want to continue on with the series. But if it's a YA fantasy series, so if you're interested in those kind of like genre, then it definitely is interesting, and I'll tell you when I read the second book if it's worth picking up. Right now, I'm not really sure. The next book that I read that was actually an extra book that wasn't on my TBR from last month was Carmilla by Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu, and it was edited by Carmen Maria Machado. This story came out before Dracula, and a lot of people say that it was kind of Dracula was influenced, and it influenced Dracula in that it's a story about a vampire, and Carmilla, who is this vampire, apparently has gone through several centuries of basically killing people through, like, you know, sucking their blood, but she does it in a very intimate way. Like, she gets very close to the people that she wants to basically take their life away. And she ends up doing that with this like, I don't know, like very fancy person. I don't remember her name, but she kind of like gets involved with her, and it's actually an LGBTQ story because the kind of like 2 girls that kind of like fall in love with each other, like Carmilla and the main character. And I don't know, it was a good story. I gave it 4 stars. It was almost a 3-star though for me because, like, I don't know, it was a little boring. I really liked the story in the end, and it was a short read, so it wasn't like I was suffering through it or anything like that. But it has these really interesting footnotes, and it also has really beautiful illustrations. Like, that's one of the illustrations. I'm sorry, that was a little risque. I'm sorry. But yeah, it was good. I recommend it if you really love Dracula and if you love vampire stories, then definitely read this, especially if you like the history of Dracula and where the story came from. Then I would definitely recommend reading this. So the next book that I read in the month of June was Gwendy's Magic Feather by Richard Chizmar. This is the second book in what is turning into be a series that was co-written by Stephen King. The first book, which was Gwendy's Button Box, and it's about Gwendy. And she is older now, but in Gwendy's Button Box, she was this young girl who found this box that had a bunch of buttons and 2 levers on the side from this mysterious character in a black bowler hat. And he basically gave it to her, saying that he trusted in her and that she had to be careful with the responsibility of it, which is that if you push one of the buttons, a continent that is related to that button will be destroyed, I think it'd be blown up. So like each of these buttons represented the different continents. One lever may produce a 1984 Morgan silver dollar, and the other lever gave you a little small chocolate animal with very extreme detail to it, and that if you ate the chocolate, you not only didn't want any more sweets, but you actually like kind of got rejuvenated and you became like younger, you got sleeker, you got more intelligent, it basically did anything you could think of. But there is a cost in that if you keep taking these, it kind of feels as though the box is taking over your mind and it's kind of influencing you to do things that you don't necessarily want to do. And so that happens in Gwendy's button box. In Gwendy's Magic Feather, the box turns up in her life again. It's like 20 years later, she's grown up, she works in the government now, she's actually a congresswoman, and the box kind of turns up again, and nothing exactly happens through the box, but it's the influence of the box in her life and how it's back in her life again, and she isn't sure if she could trust it, trust herself, and trust anyone else with the box. And so it was a really interesting read. The cover is just beautiful. I had mentioned it in my last video as one of the most prettiest covers that I've bought so far this year, but it was a very interesting book. I recommend reading it, and the third book in this series is actually going to be coming out in 2022 in February, so I recommend reading it before the third book comes out because it is a really easy read to get into. And the final book that I read this month was actually an ARC, so for the first time I was able to get 2 books from NetGalley, which I'm going to be reviewing over the next month or two. And the book that I got was The Binding Tempest, which is actually the first book in a fantasy series, a sci-fi fantasy series that just came out in June 1st, I believe. I recommend reading it extremely because I ended up giving it 4 stars. I ended up giving The Binding Tempest 4 stars. It was really beautiful. I recommend, if you want extensive notes on what I thought about the story, I recommend going back to my last vlog, which is, I described quite a bit about it in detail. Basically, it's about this world that's steampunk oriented in that there's a lot of scientists and inventors that have created all these steampunk-esque technologies, but there's also a lot of magic in the world, and that there are magic that you can summon, that you can put into objects like crystals. And it seems as though the world has kind of started to go back into war with each other. And there's a lot of disarray and corruption between not only the government that kind of created this peace for a very long time. There's corruption going on with that. There's also corruption going on with this secret society they call like the Whispers or something like that. I can't remember exactly what it's called, but there seems to be corruption with that too. So even communication between like different factions seems to be corrupted. And so these this like group of people that some of them are very new to everything and they don't really know what's going on. Some of them are very old and that they actually fought in the Great War. They kind of band together and they try to find this stone called the Tempest Stone, and they describe that it's going to help them in being able to protect like the relics and protect the history of what happened before the Great War, and basically what's going to be able to get them out of this fighting and this corruption that's happening currently. And it was a very interesting story. I gave it 4 stars. I really enjoyed it, and I definitely gave it a very thorough review, both on NetGalley, on Goodreads, and also through the last vlog. So again, if you want more details about the story, I recommend going back to any of those things. But I give it 4 stars, and I recommend you picking it up. Okay, so that is all of the books that I read in June. Again, it was an amazing reading month. I loved every single book that I read for the most part. Obviously, some of them. But I loved every book that I read. I was very happy that I had the opportunity to be able to take part in that readathon with Maddie, and it really pushed me to levels that I wasn't expecting. It really has motivated me to be able to read a lot more, and I'm excited to see what comes in the month of July. So if you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel. Please like this video if you enjoyed it. Let me know what you read in the month of June, and I look forward to seeing you in another video. Bye!